In 2024, Donald Trump won the largest share of non-white voters ever recorded for a Republican presidential candidate, and by all definitions of logic, that makes no sense. I mean, we know that Trump ran on an anti immigrant, white nationalist platform, and yet his multiracial coalition continues to expand. But at the same time, I don't think that that shift is accidental. I actually think it's the result of a years long experiment within the Republican Party on how racial minorities will fit into the larger American conservative movement. And if you look even closer at that experiment, one particular group keeps repeatedly cropping up at its center, and that is, of course, Indian Americans. On paper, Indian Americans are not like the most natural Republican constituency. Like, they're obviously an immigrant community, they're on average highly educated, and they historically vote for Democrats. So the question is, why are they the vessel for multiracial conservatism in America? And really, how can we understand the GOP's strategy around racial minorities through the Indian American figures that they have chosen? My name is Akhil. I'm a writer based in Brooklyn, and I like talking about culture and politics, so I encourage you to subscribe. But today we're going to try to understand the rise of multiracial conservatism in America by looking at how these prominent Indian American figureheads contributed to its modern form, starting with a fellow Southern boy named Bobby Jindal.
Overnight, the winds came up. We have torrential rain now all across the parish. They now have sustained winds at around 6 a.m. of 60 miles an hour, with wind gusts up to 70 and 75.
When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, it felt like America's first natural disaster. Katrina's horrors became global news, and it came to symbolize the incompetence of the Republican Bush administration. It was a reckoning for the GOP, especially as national politics gave way to the hope and the swag of the Obama era, and Republicans really feared being left behind in what felt like a total political and cultural realignment. But their first glimmer of hope was actually the first Indian American governor in US history, a Reagan devotee named Bobby Jindal. Born as Piyush Jindal in 1971, he made three decisions pretty early on in his life that would come to define his political identity. One was that at 5 years old, he changed his name to Bobby after the Brady Bunch. The second one was that in high school, he converted to Catholicism from Hinduism. And then third, he would go on to insist that he had never experienced prejudice growing up in the 80s and 90s in Louisiana. After going to Brown, getting a Rhodes Scholarship, working at McKinsey, he returned to Louisiana at 24 as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Hospitals, and he became really well known in state politics for bringing the state's flailing Medicaid program back into a surplus. And this is where he really started honing a political identity around assimilation and merit. Bobby Jindal was one of the first American politicians to ever brand himself as a technocrat, but it was especially effective then because it allowed the GOP to counter narratives about their own inept leadership while making Bobby's race and religion a lot easier to swallow for Republican voters. And it was this identity that stood out in the aftermath of Katrina and really led Bobby to victory in the 2007 governor race, making Bobby the youngest sitting governor in the US and the first non white governor to ever serve in Louisiana. Early on, Bobby got a lot of positive national attention for coordinating the state's response to Hurricane Gustav in 2008. And that got him invited to give the rebuttal to Obama's first address to a joint session of Congress. This was a huge moment for Bobby, and it was really a test screening for his specific model of multiracial conservatism. Unfortunately, he really flopped.
Let me tell you a story. Like the president's father, my own parents came to this country from a distant land.
For Americans who had never heard of him, Bobby's performance felt really awkward, especially compared to the effortless charisma and presence that made Obama such a star. And this was a politician who was already accused of careful identity construction, so Bobby's inability to pull off that performance really became career defining. Bobby, on the other hand, was totally undeterred. He was dead set on becoming the Indian Ronald Reagan, but as he shifted his attention fully to national politics, back home, Louisiana was on the precipice of serious fiscal disaster. Bobby inherited a surplus in his first term, and by his second term, the state was in the early stages of a structural deficit, So the most logical action at this point would have been to raise taxes to compensate. But Bobby was really committed to this taxpayer protection pledge that was really in the interest of his national political career, so he didn't want to do that. Instead, against his colleagues' wishes and warnings, Bobby pushed through the largest income tax cut in the history of Louisiana. And to make the situation appear less dire, he started using these gimmicks and short term solutions to plug holes and gaps in the state budget. This left Louisiana on the brink of total economic disaster and completely tarnished Bobby's technocrat image. So, for his impending presidential campaign, Bobby had to pivot to the only thing that would keep him in the game, and that was, of course, his faith. So he hired all these evangelical advisors. He started framing religious liberties as under attack, basically in an attempt to argue that the biggest victims of modern American society were actually evangelical Christians. This didn't translate into much electoral success for him. Low polling kept him out of the primetime debates, and weak fundraising basically made him suspend his bid after 5 months. Bobby Jindal is now this kind of like footnote of American history, but to understand multiracial conservatism, I think we need to understand Bobby as the original prototype. This is someone who spent his whole political career trying to convince his white counterparts that his merit, his competence would compensate for his race. But once the GOP really started embracing culture wars, he obviously could no longer be taken seriously as the leader of the conservative movement. But rising parallel to Bobby Jindal around the same time was a much smarter, savvier Indian American politician who presented a totally different model of multiracial conservatism, one where you didn't need to pretend to be white and you didn't even have to pretend to be Christian. And she's a woman.
Down where the blue Atlantic rolls against warm white sands and palm-fringed shores lies the state of South Carolina.
When Nikki Haley first ran for state legislature in this male dominated government, few people thought that she could actually win against her Southern pedigreed opponent, but it was actually under these competitive circumstances that she made a huge decision that would come to define her vision of multiracial conservatism for years to come. Her campaign was successful enough to force a runoff, at which point her opponent decided to create these mailers that included her birth name and also pictured her father in a turban, obviously in an attempt to make it about race. But instead of distancing herself from her race, like many other non white conservatives that we know, Nikki actually doubled down. She took a risk and decided to place her race front and center. She chose to distribute a picture of her Indian parents dressed in their traditional clothing with a really well respected congressman, and she ended up winning the entire thing, starting this unprecedented reign of over 12 years in South Carolina state government. As she rose from state representative to governor, then to presidential candidate, Nikki gained a reputation for this kind of unprincipled opportunism, basically just doing whatever she needed to do for her career. But when an unthinkable tragedy struck South Carolina, she developed her strongest political conviction. On June 17th, 2015, white supremacist Dylan Roof opened fire at a Bible study group at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. In released photos, he makes a tribute to the Confederate flag, the same flag flying high outside the South Carolina State House for over 50 years. After Nikki saw the photos, she called in a lot of favors to get support for removing it from the state capitol, but even with a ton of national pressure, it was still uncertain whether the resolution would be passed. So, behind closed doors, she made this final plea telling a story about a little Indian girl who went to a roadside fruit stand in South Carolina with her family. We got out of the car and started filling bags with different things. I was just walking along with my dad, pointing out fruits I wanted him to buy. We had the place to ourselves. No other customers were there, just the owners. All of a sudden, two police cars came charging up to the stand. Officers got out of the cars and went and stood by the cash register. I watched them out of the corner of my eye as they talked to the couple at the register and looked back at us. Then I realized they were there because of us. My dad continued filling his bags like nothing was happening. When he was done, he took his basket of fruit over to the register. He said hello to the couple standing next to the policeman and paid for his items. We got back into the car in total silence. Even then, I knew this was a part of his daily life that he hoped I hadn't noticed. But I did notice, and it hurt. This was not only the defining moment of Nikki's career, it also forged her most authentic political conviction. It wasn't just about the fruit stand, it was about the state senators who humiliated her with jokes about alien gods. It was about her team having to remove the Confederate flag from the place she celebrated winning the governor election. It was about her dad having to hide in the back when she spoke so people wouldn't see his turban. When the Confederate flag finally came down, Nikki doubled down on her belief in the multiracial future of the Republican Party, envisioning an entirely new version of multiracial conservatism, one that didn't ask voters to ignore race, but see her as proof of conservatism's inclusivity. This came to a head in the 2016 presidential election, where she betrayed her longtime supporter, Jeb Bush, in favor of Marco Rubio, who embodied her vision of multiracial conservatism. But when Trump won the whole thing, she started scrambling to find her place in a party that she really couldn't recognize. Lucky for her, one of Trump's allies in South Carolina wanted Nikki out of the state. So even though she was such an outspoken opponent of Trump's campaign, she got offered the UN ambassadorship. And despite her personal dislike of Trump, the UN ambassadorship was an immediate ticket to national politics, so she accepted. Some of you might not remember this, but there was a moment initially when Republicans didn't really know how to achieve their policy goals with Trump. And this to me is Nikki's actual legacy, is that she was one of the first establishment Republicans to figure out how to translate Trump's populist rhetoric into policy. One example of this is how in 2017, when tensions with North Korea were rising and Trump started tweeting about fire and fury, Nikki was tasked with getting UN sanctions against North Korea, which to many seemed impossible because the sanctions had to go through the UN Security Council, where two of North Korea's allies, Russia and China, had veto power. But in private negotiations, she framed herself as the level headed counterpart to the president's unpredictable whim, and she ended up securing 3 unanimous votes for sanctions against North Korea. This has become the de facto model of American conservatism, using Trump's political theater to more quietly push a sweeping conservative policy agenda that deals the actual damage. And this is in part owed to Nikki Haley, who built a process of accommodating Trump's rhetoric in American conservatism. But what this meant for Nikki is that her vision of a multiracial GOP was dead. So even though she performed well as a candidate in the 2024 presidential race, the party had long since moved on without her. During one of these 2024 presidential debates, Nikki's model of multiracial conservatism faced off with the next iteration, a fellow Indian American, a fellow business person, but this guy played a little dirtier. Nikki doesn't lose her poise a lot, but next we're going to talk about the man who she ended up calling scum on national television. There are more than 7 million Americans living with Alzheimer's today, but briefly, in 2015, there was hope for a cure. A drug called intepirdine was being hailed as a breakthrough treatment for Alzheimer's, and this led to what was then the largest biotech IPO ever, valuing a company called Axovant Sciences at $3 billion. When it was announced only 2 years later that the drug trial failed, the stock completely crashed, hurting tons of people who bought into not just the promise of a cure for Alzheimer's, but of a new era of healthcare optimized by the private sector. One person who got away unscathed selling his shares of the stock before it collapsed was the founder of Axovant Sciences, Ohio-born, Indian American, Vivek Ramaswamy. Up until that point, Vivek was a huge success. He was the valedictorian of his high school, he went to Harvard, he interned at Goldman Sachs, but in the wake of the biggest failure of his life, he decides to buck his history of being totally apolitical and becomes one of the first soldiers in the war against woke. In 2021, Vivek bursts onto the conservative media circuit peddling this book called Woke Incorporated, which basically argues that corporate, social, and DEI programs are shallow and ineffective, but they're also at the same time these huge existential threats to American democracy. And that is what he and many others call woke. I want to note here that unlike Bobby or Nikki, Vivek is framing himself as a businessman, a scientist, an outsider to politics, instead of meaningfully working his way through any kind of local or state politics. He is becoming a vessel of a multiracial conservatism centered around culture wars, which is an attempt to meet the MAGA moment. Even though Vivek becomes this kind of defender of American values, he doesn't get so far electorally. As we've seen with other Indian American conservatives, Vivek's contribution to American conservatism is more subtle, and this becomes more clear when you consider Vivek as the link to broligarchy. The current Trump administration has unprecedented ties to and support from American big tech CEOs, with its most visible ally on and off being Elon Musk. And immediately after the election, Elon led DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, which tries to shrink government and run America like a business. And who better to serve as the bridge between all out conservative technocracy and establishment conservative politics than a businessman turned woke warrior? So it's Vivek and Elon on this massive press tour for DOGE. And even though I think Vivek sounds like a high school policy debater, he's killing it. I mean, he's running the government without ever being elected into office. Like this is the conservative dream. But as we've seen time and time again, his race gets in the way. So, despite branding himself as a nationalist, a defender of Judeo Christian values, Vivek still identifies as a Hindu Indian immigrant. Because alongside that kind of like anti woke business persona, Vivek holds a genuine belief in the value and place of certain immigrants in America. And he does all kinds of rhetorical gymnastics to fit that within the ideology of Trumpism. This undercurrent of Vivek's political beliefs came to a head when there was a larger debate around H-1B visas. And Vivek makes this long tweet reframing the debate in terms of culture, saying that American culture fosters mediocrity over merit. And the subtext really being that American culture has some deficiencies compared to the immigrant cultures that do get H-1B visas. And I mean, this single handedly kills his credibility. The base that he was trying to foster is built on American exceptionalism and, frankly, our superiority to other immigrant cultures. I mean, immigrants are the ones that are supposed to be ruining America. This really is the kind of tragic cycle that Vivek is trapped in. More than anything, Vivek believes in merit, like many other Indian Americans. Vivek thinks that if you do well, if you study, if you work hard, you can make it, even if you're trying to be the leader of a nativist movement as an immigrant. But wait, what if I told you that Vivek's argument about merit and the laziness of American culture is probably not his? What if I told you it came from a mentor not only to him, but to Vice President J.D. Vance and Second Lady Usha Vance? What if I told you that this mentor is not just an architect of multiracial conservatism, but of right wing power in America today at large? This is the story of a tiger mother and her cubs.
The Tiger Mom debate has captured the attention of parents all across the country. From the cover of Time magazine to the bestseller lists, Amy Chua's book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, about strict Asian parenting has exploded.
In 2011, the Wall Street Journal published this op-ed called Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior. And it opens on a list of things that the author, Amy Chua, didn't allow her daughters to do when they were growing up. And it caused a huge media frenzy. There was already this growing anxiety about the rise of Chinese power, and Amy really struck a nerve when she linked that power to something like parenting, which is really an issue of culture. The article is an excerpt from Amy's memoir called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, and it's not immediately obvious as a strain of conservative thought, but it really is a huge moment in American culture for the idea of cultural determinism, which is the belief that culture, cultural values have an outsized effect on who you become and how far you get in life. And this worldview is inherently conservative because it ignores any kind of structural inequality and places the burden on this vague idea of culture. And that is really a key logic of American culture wars. And Amy becomes a huge part of how this idea of cultural determinism re enters the American lexicon, and not just through Tiger Mother. As a professor at Yale Law School, she has a reputation as a powerful, well connected mentor, especially for students who don't quite fit the bill of the typical legacy Yale Law student. And that's across the political spectrum. So if you get in her inner circle, she can help you get a really prestigious law clerkship. And if you're one of her favorites, maybe she'll connect you with her literary agent. I have my personal suspicions that Amy was somehow involved or inspired Vivek as a former Yale law student to get his own culture war memoir published, but she was definitely tangibly part of how one of the largest culture war memoirs of all time was published. So, in the same year that Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother was published, one of her students and future Vice President J.D. Vance emailed her this touching story about growing up in Appalachia with a drug addicted mother. And Amy emailed him back, "You have a book in you." The result was Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of white poverty that not only launched J.D. Vance's political career, but entirely reshaped conservative rhetoric around this idea of the white working class. So between Tiger Mother, Hillbilly Elegy, and then later Woke Inc., we see these different ways of weaponizing personal storytelling in service of culture wars, which is important because these books rely on a lot of anecdotal evidence to make their points, and the central argument across these books seems to reveal a kind of deeper, almost romanticization of culture as destiny. And that is a really effective worldview that scales across race and class. But this video isn't actually about J.D. Vance. It's about the Indian American woman that stands behind him, his law school crush, the mother to his three children, with a fourth one coming. Usha Vance. Usha is just a classic overachiever. She's known for working hard, getting good grades, getting into amazing schools, and just doing really everything you're supposed to do as the eldest daughter of immigrants. And she also goes to Yale Law, where she's also mentored by Amy Chua, and of course meets her future husband, JD Vance. The defining aspect of Usha's politics is its ambiguity. She's been described as leftish or moderate or centrist. She was a registered Democrat in 2014, but she apparently has a track record of dating conservative men. She clerked for Brett Kavanaugh, but then also worked for a more progressive law firm. And she's an extremely private person, even as Second Lady, which is a huge contrast to how we've seen some other women in the conservative movement perform. But Usha, to me, is really the final form, or at least one of the most powerful forms of multiracial conservatism, because she seems to really represent how easily the immigrant mentality can be manipulated into conservatism. And that's really what the Tiger Mother won't tell you, is that the only political value that seems to be guiding Usha is the idea of getting ahead, of working hard, keeping your head down, regardless of what you're actually standing for or your complicity. And that, to me, is really representative of contemporary multiracial conservatism. And that mentality is part of why, even though Indian Americans vote Democrat at scale, we've become some of the biggest figureheads in the history of the American conservative movement. And really, that's because conservatives have found the perfect place for our apoliticalness, for our intense desire for status and wealth. And that's on the sidelines. That's selling conservatism. That's doing this kind of hidden labor of making it work and bringing it to the masses. So, when we consider the history of Indian American conservatives as we've discussed it, it's fitting that Usha really is the final form of this lineage. Starting with Bobby Jindal, Indian American conservatives have consistently failed to become national leaders, and that's because our role within American conservatism is not to lead it, but to launder it. And that's really become a vital function. Indian Americans have really supported the growth and evolution of conservatism, both among racial minorities, but also at large. Okay, so if you've made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I want to end really quickly by speaking directly to any Indian Americans, any South Asians in America, any children children of immigrants, Asian Americans. I'm also all of those things. And I just want to say that your apoliticalness, your neutrality is literally being taken advantage of. And listen, if all you want out of life is status and wealth, then this isn't a message for you. But I know that there are so many of us out there that have values outside of that. And expressing those values through politics is important now more than ever. And trust me, I get that impulse. I understand that training to keep your head down, to play it safe, to just do the steps that you're supposed to do. But in my experience, that training that we get a lot of times from our families is born of fear and scarcity. And in all honesty, operating that way in today's world will hold you and us back. And your political voice, I promise, is needed. Okay, I'm going to end there for now. Thank you for watching this. I plan to make more videos in this vein, so I would encourage you to subscribe if you liked this one. I also post on TikTok and Substack if you would like to find me there. That's it for now.